In the world, there are locations that some may consider strange. Of course, there are typically haunted houses and old burial grounds that may or may not actually be supernatural, but none can truly comprehend the happenings of the Dillerson farm. The Dillerson farm was a place that even the bravest adventurers would not go. It was hard to call skeptics truly skeptic when they refused to set foot on the place. The origins of the Dillerson farm were not exactly known, but its history was enough to write a book. The first case would be from 1962. The Dillerson farm would be inherited by John and Mabel Dillerson, along with their 4 children. John inherited the farm from his grandfather, who passed away of tuberculosis. John's grandfather, Henry, would be described as a good man. He was a hard worker who cared about his farm just as much as he cared about his family. For many decades, Henry lived on the farm, though it was never known if he owned the farm or if he inherited himself. In Henry's final days, he was hysterical. In his hospital, he would scream constantly about holes in the fields and hands rising from the ground. It was never known what he meant before he died. That is until John inherited the farm. Neighbors were not as keen to these Dillersons as they were to Henry. John was described as a raging drunk, and Mabel was a loud, burdensome woman. The 3 Dillerson sons were troublesome teens who would skip school and throw parties on the farm. The one Dillerson daughter was a sheltered and spoiled child. Police would be called to the Dillerson farm almost daily. From domestic abuse to noise complaints, there was nothing the Dillersons weren't notorious for. That is until the night of May 16, 1963. At around midnight, neighbors heard Mabel Dillerson screaming and shouting from the fields. She was naked and red in the face. She seemed unspeakably hysterical about something. The situation quickly turned grim when it was discovered why she was behaving this way. A few days before, Mabel's beloved cat Whiskey had gone missing. Mabel speculated that perhaps John had something to do with it. It wasn't until that night that Mabel was taking a late shower when she heard faint meows from the bathroom window. She didn't even put any clothes on before she ran outside. That is when she was met with a grisly sight. Mabel discovered Whiskey, but he'd been completely skinned. It wasn't like his fur had been shaved. Whiskey's skin was completely gone. It was like it had been cleanly peeled. The worst part was that the poor thing was still alive. Seeing this, Mabel went into an absolute meltdown. She began screaming naked into the night, blaming John. Mabel spent that night in police custody for her own protection. John got his rifle and put the poor feline out of its misery. Who would do something so heinous? No animal or person should ever have to go through something so horrendous. The next event would take place on February 2nd, 1964 at 10 p.m. Police were called to the Dillerson farm after gunshots were heard. When they arrived on the scene, John Dillerson was out in his backyard. He was an incoherent mess. He was screaming about the farm's well. He claimed to have witnessed each and every other Dillerson member get dragged into the well. He spoke of black oily tendrils arise from the well and pull Mabel down. She'd gone out that night to check upon the chicken coops after she heard a ruckus. John was watching from the window. He jumped up and tried to alert the kids, but they were already gone. They weren't in their beds where he'd last seen them. The gunshots rang out after John proclaimed that they came back, but it wasn't them. He spoke of something in the well that took his family, then pretended to be them. The police assumed that John had suffered a mental breakdown, executed the other Dillerson members, and disposed of their bodies in the farm's well. John was later sentenced to a mental facility for the rest of his days. The rest of the Dillerson members were never recovered, though attempts were made to recover them from the well. Though they tried, the authorities noted that the well never seemed to end. They proclaimed it was bottomless. It's not known how deep that well truly is, but this was an all too familiar situation for the neighbors of the Dillerson farm. They recalled Henry's dying ramblings. Did his talk of something in the grounds actually have weight? For almost 2 decades, the Dillerson farm would be a desolate mass of land. People around the area began to suspect that the Dillerson farm was cursed. The next event wouldn't take place until 1983. By this point, the Dillerson farm was practically in a state of abandoned disrepair. That was until the property would be purchased by Ed Smith Mining, a mining company that was mainly based in New York at the time. In late fall of that year, Ed Smith sent a 20-man crew to the Dillerson farm in the hopes of harvesting the rich soil. While Dillerson had its cursed reputation, the place would produce some of the best crops ever seen. By this point, most of the neighbors had moved away. Dillerson was officially a desolate strip of land. 15 of the men vanished one November night during a 30-minute night break. The manager had come back to find 15 of his staff gone and 4 incapacitated on the ground. Of the 4 that remained, none of them could accurately recall what happened. All that could be gathered was that the crew had heard strange noises coming from one of the freshly dug holes. One of the men went to investigate first, but he was gone for far too long. Eventually, the worker came back, but he appeared strange. The worker seemed almost anxious in trying to convince the others to follow him to the hole. That's when the 4 remaining workers blacked out, only to awaken to 15 of their comrades missing. The 15 missing workers were never found, recovered, or heard from again. Ed Smith Mining filed for bankruptcy in 1990 after the families of the missing workers filed a lawsuit against the company. To this day, the Dillerson farm still remains, untouched and unexplored. That brings us back to just a few months ago. I used to work for a team of paranormal investigators. For safety purposes, the name of my colleagues and I have been changed. Months prior, we'd been preparing for a 3-day camp and exploration of the Dillerson farm. If there truly was something cursed about the farm, we were going to find out. And that day had finally come. The team for this exploration consisted of Dave, Ashley, Hector, Rob, and myself. Dave was the leader of the exploration, as he had the most experience exploring paranormal locations. Ashley was roughly new to exploration, but she had an ambition that you just couldn't find anywhere else. Hector was the oldest of the group. He joined the team in the hopes of something breaking his skepticism of the paranormal. Rob was a stern, hard-boiled guy, but he was cool as long as you stayed on his good side. We arrived on the farm right around dusk. The place was a dusty old mess. I never thought I could describe a place as depressed, but this place was completely devoid of joy in life. The first thing Dave pointed out was the uncanny lack of sound. Nothing could be heard but the dry breeze of the dusty air. There were no birds, insects, or not even a passing car. It was just complete and utter silence. Not a single living creature had set foot on this land in years. The farm was just an abandoned purgatory lost to time. "Something feels off about this place," said Ashley. "This place sure as hell gives me the creeps, that's for sure," said Hector. I was somewhat mesmerized by the place. I'd heard about the place, but I'd never set foot on the grounds before. Seeing it in person was far more intense than any of the tales could give off. "Daylight is fading, people. Let's move," ordered Dave. He simply put what our mission was. We were to investigate the infamous well, the same one that was spoken of in the John Dillerson case. Dave's plan was to attach a submersible camera to a thick wire and send it down the well. Our plan was to see if we could find what the police never could. If John Dillerson's story had any kind of weight, then the bodies of the Dillerson family may still be in that well, if they were ever there in the first place. While Dave, Hector, and Rob set up the line and the camera for the well, Ashley and I investigate the farm and the Dillerson living quarters. The house had nothing interesting. The house, for the most part, had been completely emptied. The only thing that remained were a few old kitchen appliances. The barn was no different. The place was mostly empty other than left behind farm equipment. There was one thing that Ashley noted though. There was a strange trail in the dirt that led from the barn to a filled hole by the outhouse. The trail looked fresh. Too fresh. What made it even creepier was that the trail didn't seem like it was made by a person. It was weird and disorganized. At some points, the trail was serpentine. At other points, it turned insect-like. Ashley took a photo for the notes. I couldn't escape the unease of what could have caused that trail though. It was now 8 p.m. The line was ready to go down. I'd set up tents and placed floodlights on the scene. This was about to be a long night. Hector loaded the camera on the brim of the well. On Dave's cue, the camera began descending. "We have vision," Ashley confirmed as the camera's point of view appeared on her laptop. "It's too dark. Activate night vision," requested Dave. Ashley activated the night vision from her laptop as the camera continued to descend. There was nothing strange so far. All I could see were the walls of the well. "We've now descended 20 feet, said Ashley. The man-made stone walls of the well continued onward. It's a bit strange the well goes down this deep. The stone walls, that is," I said. Dave looked at me like I sounded like an idiot. I probably did in his mind. "We've descended to 40 feet, said Ashley. By this point, we were beginning to see the moisture against the walls. Something was a little off though. There was a strange black ooze beginning to appear in patches. At first glance, one would assume it to be mildew or sludge, but it slightly wiggled as the camera passed it. I would almost compare it to slugs. "What is that?" I asked. "Probably worms. They're decomposers, you know. Maybe they've been eating something dead down there," said Rob semi-sarcastically. "We've descended to 80 feet, said Ashley, confused. 80? What happened to 60? I asked. "I don't know. The camera completely skipped a marker." "It's just a glitch. Proceed," said Dave. Hector and Rob continued lowering the line. By this point, the walls had stopped being stone. The walls were just a combination of darkened mud and that weird black sludge. That's when the camera came to a sudden halt. "Why did you guys stop?" asked Dave. "We didn't. I think we hit something," said Rob. The camera didn't show anything though. We were still looking at the same murky sludge. That's when the second camera began to short out. The signal began to go in and out. For a split second, the screen changed to something else. "Ashley, pause the live feed and play that back," said Dave. Ashley did so, and surely enough, something showed up for a millisecond. Ashley took a few tries before she was successfully able to pause on the image. It was a black screen with a few simple words. "What are you looking for?" Seeing this made everyone pause. "Well, that's freaky," said Hector. "What do we do about that?" asked Rob. "This is just an interference. Satellite interruptions. Keep going. This has nothing to do with us," said Dave. Dave was thoroughly creeped out. I could see it all over his face. After a bit of wrestling with the wire, the camera began to descend. "We've descended 280 feet, said Ashley through a shaky voice. For the first time through the entire descent, The camera's audio detected something. It started as a slight noise, but the lower we went, the louder it became. Soon, we could vividly hear what it was. It was the painful meows of a cat. The sound was clearly a cat, but it sounded warped and distorted. The only way I could describe it was as if something that wasn't a cat was trying desperately to sound like one. Through it all, we went lower and lower. Eventually, the meowing began to sound less animalistic and more human-like. The cries of a cat began to sound like the cries of a person. Several people. The voices screamed in unison. By this point, Ashley was ready to get the hell out of there. I was as well. Rob tried his best to stay composed, but I could tell he was on the verge of freaking out. The night vision wasn't even seeing anything anymore. It was just darkness. The screen began to display words and phrases. Mabel, Bobby, Sam, Frank, Joshua, Whiskey. They're a part of us now. You can be a part of us too. Behold. The camera's footage was suddenly cut out entirely. The camera remained off for several minutes. Suddenly, Hector and Rob yelled as the wire began to rapidly descend. Something was pulling the camera, and it was pulling hard. Rob tried to grab the wire, only for it to burn his hands. The wire reached its limit. The end of the wire, which was rooted into the ground, violently popped up and went straight down the well. "No, the camera!" yelled Dave. The footage of the camera returned. The camera depth displayed as -340. The camera appeared to be somewhere else. We could see stalagmites, water, and more of that black sludge. Something picked up the camera just out of view and held it there for a few seconds. The screen displayed a final set of messages. Dave, Ashley, Rob, Hector, Mark, don't be afraid. We can keep you safe down here. The camera turned to reveal what was holding it. What we saw made us all visibly pale. A grotesque amalgamation looked into the camera. We could see what appeared to be a combination of 3 women, 4 men, a cat, and a few other creatures. All of them were covered in a coating of black fluid. In unison, they smiled into the camera. The camera went offline for good. Suddenly, we began to hear something rapidly climbing up the wall. All of us ran into the van as quickly as possible. We had no regard for our belongings or each other. All of us jumped into the vehicle and stepped on the gas like there was no tomorrow. In the rearview mirror, we could see a disgusting mass chasing us on thin, insect-like legs. The entire ride was silent. All of us were lost in our own shock. We just discovered something horrifying at the Dillerson farm. But all the evidence had just been abandoned there. When something like that happens, you don't think about evidence or conspiracy. All that's on your mind is survival. I gave up on paranormal investigation after that. I think all of us did. I never heard from any of them again. I assume they all just went out and got normal jobs. I never saw or heard mention of the Dillerson farm ever again. Truth be told, I don't think I want to know anything about it. If it were up to me, I'd tell the military to go in there and burn the place to ashes. There are some things in this world that human eyes were not meant to understand. What was in that well? Whatever became of it? I've made several theories on what it could have been. I first thought that there's some body-snatching aliens living under the Dillerson farm. My other theory was that the well may have been some sort of portal to hell. I don't think I'll ever truly know what it was. However, I'll leave off with a simple message. If you ever come across a place called the Dillerson farm, stay the hell away from it. The Dillerson farm is a place lost to time. It is a place that remains a desolate blind spot in the eyes of God. And that is what it must remain. Whatever you do, let the Dillerson farm rot.